When I was 19, my sister Madeline told me I was a disgrace to the Hart family. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She simply stood in the doorway of my bedroom and said, "You're ruining everything we've built," like she was diagnosing a leak in a pipe. Her tone didn't shake, but something in me did. The video had surfaced that morning. A private moment, intimate, messy, stupid, filmed without my consent, by someone I thought I loved now, uploaded and dissected by strangers. I didn't know it existed until my phone began to buzz with whispers. A friend texted then another. A voicemail I couldn't bring myself to play. I didn't cry, not yet. My mind was moving too fast to mourn. By noon, Madeline had already emailed the link to our father. Subject line, "You need to act. This could escalate." She didn't call me first. She didn't ask if I was okay. She saw a storm and chose to evacuate. My father, Gregory Hart, retired police captain, now a revered figure in the city council, came home early that day. His uniform might have been packed away, but his presence still marched into rooms before he did. I was in the kitchen trying to drink water when he slammed the front door so hard the walls trembled. "You think we raised you for this," he barked, "to be paraded like trash on the internet." I opened my mouth, but only breath came out. "I didn't post it," I finally whispered. "I was violated." "No," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You violated this family." He dropped my university diploma on the table like an unpaid bill. "Congratulations," he said, voice drenched in disdain. "A degree in, what was it again? Human studies, emotional nonsense." I didn't reply. Not because I agreed, but because I knew better. I had lived long enough under his roof to understand that in his world, silence didn't mean peace. It meant survival. Then came the final act of exile. A single bag, my clothes, some sketchbooks, a toothbrush left on the front porch like a forgotten delivery. When I tried my key, it didn't fit. The lock had been changed, just like that. No goodbye, no, we'll figure this out. Just silence, the kind that builds walls instead of bridges. My mother didn't say a word through any of it. She stood behind the sheer curtains of the living room window, rosary in hand, eyes heavy but unmoving. She saw me walk up. She saw me try the door. She saw me realize what had happened. And she didn't flinch, didn't wave, didn't pray out loud. That night, I sat on the porch beside my bag. The wooden planks creaked beneath me, a familiar sound that suddenly felt foreign. I looked at the red backpack I'd had since my freshman year, still stained with coffee from finals week, still full of charcoal pencils, folded poems, and pages of who I used to be. I thought about all the dinners where my voice got lost in the echo of Madeline's accomplishments. The straight A's, the mock trials, the scholarships. I remembered the way my father used to look at her like she was the extension of his legacy, and at me like I was someone else's child. There was no official disownment, no dramatic confrontation with cameras or tears, just a slow surgical removal of belonging. And that, I think, is the cruelty no one talks about. When strangers hurt you, you rage. When friends betray you, you cry. But when family quietly decides you're no longer one of them, when the people who raised you erase you without a sound, that pain has no name. It just lingers. Like a ghost. I took the bag, stood up, and walked into the night. No destination, no plan. Just the hum of streetlights, the weight of silence, and a promise forming in my throat not of revenge, not even of justice, but of survival. That porch with its peeling white paint and pot of dead marigolds became a monument in my memory, a symbol of everything I had to leave behind in order to find myself. A place where a family once stood and where I was told without words that I was no longer allowed to stand with them. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, with nothing but a torn backpack and a name I would soon abandon, I understood something for the first time. You don't need a villain to feel destroyed. Sometimes all it takes is a locked door and a family who decides you're better off on the outside. And sometimes that's the beginning. I didn't know where the bus was headed when I climbed aboard. I just knew it was headed away. The driver asked for my destination. I glanced at the worn map taped beside the window and pointed at the name I recognized from an old Georgia O'Keeffe biography I once read in college. Santa Fe, I said. He nodded like it made perfect sense. The greyhound moved like a question that didn't want to be answered. I watched highway signs pass by like old lovers, distant, unreadable. Around me, people talked in half sentences, made phone calls, and opened sandwiches wrapped in foil. I sat in the back, the hum of the wheels, filling the places where my thoughts used to be. I had no money except what I'd taken from my emergency envelope taped beneath my desk drawer. I'd grabbed it in those first few seconds after seeing the bag on the porch, like instinct, like muscle memory from a version of me who always suspected this day would come. In my backpack, 2 shirts, 1 sweater, 3 pairs of socks, my old sketchbook, and a red leather notebook filled with pieces of the life I'd now left behind. The first 3 nights in Santa Fe, I stayed on benches near the Cathedral Plaza. I tucked myself between stone and shadow, pretending to be a traveller between trains, instead of a girl no longer claimed by anyone. During the day, I wandered. At a corner bakery, a woman named Carla let me wash dishes in exchange for a cup of soup and a clean apron I used as a blanket that night. She never asked questions, and I never offered answers. Her kindness was brief, necessary, and blessedly quiet. By the 6th night, I found myself near the edge of the rail yard, beneath an overpass painted with murals of desert gods and blooming cactus. A little further down, a fire pit built from an old shopping cart burned weakly. There was no one else there. Only the wind, only the ache of being unmoored. That's when I opened the backpack. I didn't think I just moved, like someone reaching into themselves for the last splinter before the wound could close. I pulled out the red leather notebook first. Inside, my mother's sticky note recipes, tea for sore throats, soup for long study nights. One read, add nutmeg to milk for dreams. Another, never cook angry. I remembered her handwriting before I remembered her voice. Then came the drawing from my 12th birthday. Madeleine had sketched it for me in secret, just us as kids on the swings. She'd written underneath, for when we grow up and forget how to fly. I'll remind you. I held the page between my fingers like it was made of breath. Then I tore it in half. The rest followed. Each recipe, each note, each certificate, little things once sacred, now only evidence of a life I was no longer welcome to live. I found a lighter in the side pocket of my bag. One I'd used for candles in college for incense I pretended made me calm. That night, I used it to burn everything. The fire started with a soft sigh. The pages curled inward like they wanted to protect themselves. Flames danced low and slow, licking the ink, swallowing the past in letters and smoke. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because some things are too sacred for tears. I whispered to the smoke. If I have nothing left, I'll begin with what's left of me. The wind caught the ashes and carried them down the empty rail line like ghosts returning home. I slept against the warm concrete that night, backpack lighter chest, quieter. I didn't dream. The next morning, I used the bathroom sink at a nearby gas station to wash the soot from my palms. The mirror above the faucet was cracked one long line, splitting my reflection in half. It felt accurate. I looked at myself. Eyes ringed with fatigue, hair tangled, lips dry, but still standing. Still me. Something inside me shifted, not victory, not peace, but a kind of surrender that felt like a beginning. I didn't know who I would become, only that Evelyn Hart was gone. She had burned beside the poems and recipes. What remained was someone unnamed, someone unmade. Later that day, I found a flyer at a library bulletin board, temp help needed. No questions asked. I tore off a tab and walked 4 blocks to the address. They asked for a name. I gave one that wasn't mine, Eve Carter. The woman behind the desk nodded, scribbled something on a clipboard, and didn't ask me to spell it twice. That's how the second part of my life began. Not with grand plans or a guiding light, but with ash under my nails, a stranger's name, and a small, quiet lie that let me keep breathing. And somehow that was enough. The room I found was barely wider than a closet, the kind of place where light bulbs flicker just often enough to feel haunted. It had one window, facing a brick wall, a single mattress laid directly on the floor, and water stains on the ceiling that looked like continents no one ever visited. But the door locked, and the silence inside wasn't cruel, it was mine. I worked 3 jobs. Mornings were for pouring coffee and balancing burnt toast at a diner off Central Avenue. I learned to memorize orders without hearing them. Customers rarely looked me in the eye, and I was grateful. Afternoons were for mopping floors at a pediatric clinic. I swept around forgotten crayons and half-finished colouring sheets, tiny reminders that someone somewhere believed in happy endings. Nights were for data entry at a logistics firm that operated out of a converted garage. No one there knew my last name, and I didn't offer one. I ate peanut butter sandwiches and counted my change in quarters. Some nights I skipped dinner and scribbled instead. I filled the margins of old receipts with thoughts I couldn't say out loud. It wasn't poetry and it wasn't journaling, it was something else. A code only I could read. It was the same code I invented as a child, back when I still believed secrets needed keys and words could be protected with patterns. My mind needed that again now, language that couldn't be weaponized by anyone but me. When I could afford it, I bought cheap acrylic paint from the dollar store and used an old toothbrush to make art. Not beautiful art, not even art maybe, just colour and movement and proof that I still existed. One canvas, if you could call it that, was a flattened cereal box layered in midnight blue and smudged with black fingerprints. I called it Collapse. I hung it behind the curtain where no one would ever ask about it. And that felt right, because survival is rarely pretty, but it is a form of art. It was near midnight on a Tuesday when the hallway at the clinic erupted. I was finishing my shift bleach bucket in one hand, mop in the other, when I heard the shouting. Spanish, urgent, frightened. A woman, small, clutching a child, stood backed against the wall, eyes wide with panic. In front of her was a uniformed officer, waving a stack of forms in her face. Firma Eki, he barked. It's already processed. Just sign. She shook her head slowly, tears welling. I didn't think. I stepped forward. She's not signing that, I said. My voice surprised even me. The officer turned. Who the hell are you? I stood straighter. Someone who knows that coercing a signature on outdated documents violates every legal standard of informed consent. That part was a lie, but it sounded official enough. He narrowed his eyes. You got no authority. Maybe I said, but you've got no translator, no due process, and no idea how many witnesses are watching. He hesitated, grumbled, then walked away. The woman whispered a quiet gracias without looking up. Her daughter, maybe 4 or 5, peeked at me from behind her mother's coat. Her eyes were wide and still, and in that moment, I saw my younger self. Not in the girl, but in the mother, the one standing without protection, without power, just presence. It was tracing. 2 days later, I was called into the clinic's admin office. I thought I was about to be fired. Instead, I met Rafael Delgado, a soft-spoken man with sharp eyes, who introduced himself as the director of Comunidad Legal, a non-profit advocating for undocumented immigrants. I heard what happened Tuesday night, he said. I didn't do much, I replied. I just stepped in. Most people don't, he said, especially when it's not their fight. I shrugged. I think it was. He paused, studied me. Have you ever thought about doing more than just cleaning rooms? I smiled, half wary, half hopeful. All I've ever done, I said quietly, is survive. Maybe it's time I learned something else. He offered me a part-time role intake assistant, outreach translator, errand runner. Nothing glamorous, nothing permanent. But it was enough. Enough to be near something that mattered. Enough to feel like maybe I wasn't the only one trying to become someone new. And so I began again. This time, not in the shadows, but at the edge of someone else's fear. Not to save them, but to remember I was still worth saving too. The office at Comunidad Legal wasn't glamorous. A second-floor walk-up with flickering lights and a window that rattled in high winds. The heater clicked like it was remembering how to work. My desk was next to the copier under a window that looked out onto the alley behind a bakery. The glass was frosted at the edges, so you could see out, but no one could see in. I liked it that way. No headshots on the walls, no plaques with my name, just a stack of intake forms, a dented coffee mug, and a file folder labelled simply Eve Carter. My first week, I translated documents, filed grant applications, and learned how to listen. Not with the intent to fix, but to understand. Raphael told me once, sometimes our job isn't to rescue anyone. It's to remind them they're still visible. I started sitting in on city council meetings, at first in the back, just to take notes, then to learn the language of power, how it whispered in policy and smirked in budget reports. I took online classes at night, public policy, immigration law, administrative ethics. I didn't post about it, didn't add it to any resume. I wasn't chasing recognition. I was building fluency in silence. Eventually, Raphael trusted me with more, drafting policy briefs, coordinating community outreach, negotiating partnerships. I found joy in spreadsheet strategy and sentences that might shape someone's future. One afternoon, a reporter visited the office. Young, earnest. We'd love to do a piece on the invisible force behind the new advocacy initiative, she said. No photos, I said. She blinked. But people should know who you are. They know what I do, I replied. That's enough. Over time, my name started appearing in the footnotes of legislation. Then, in the acknowledgements of council votes. Eventually, on the ballot. The night I was elected to the city council, I didn't throw a party. I sat alone in my apartment, the walls still bare, and lit a single candle. Not in celebration, but in quiet defiance of everything that had tried to erase me. That year, I worked tirelessly behind the scenes. I learned how to draft a policy that could stand against scrutiny. I built coalitions with people who didn't care where I came from, only whether I showed up when it counted. I didn't wear expensive suits. I didn't give soaring speeches. I asked questions that no one else dared. Questions like, who benefits from this silence? And what happens when the undocumented stay, invisible not by choice, but by law? I read case law on weekends, memorized the housing code at midnight, wrote community newsletters at the bus stop. I wasn't the loudest, but I never missed a vote. When I pushed for emergency housing reform, I got anonymous letters calling me a traitor. When I supported a bill to restrict local law enforcement's cooperation with federal raids, protesters circled my apartment with flags and slurs. But I stayed. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the person who doesn't flinch when the room goes quiet. 2 years later, I ran for state representative, then for lieutenant governor. Every campaign was minimal, no glossy mailers, no family photo ops, just policy, just work, just proof that I kept showing up. When I announced my bid for governor, most people didn't recognize my name, but they recognized the results of what I'd written, shaped, and pushed into law. And for some voters, that was enough. And then one grey November morning, I stood on the Capitol steps and took the oath of office as governor of Colorado. No family in the crowd, no mention of the girl I used to be. Only the wind, the mountains, and the quiet. Inside the governor's office, there was a window. Narrow, frosted at the edges just like the one at Comunidad Legal. I never replaced it, because I liked looking out, but not being seen. Some people chase the spotlight. I learned to trace the shadows, to find the leverage no one else noticed, to leave no fingerprints, only fingerprints of policy that changed lives. My name didn't need to be remembered, only the work. Then the call came. Not from a reporter, not from an aide, from Raphael. "It's Madeline," he said quietly, like her name still carried sharp edges. "She's under investigation. Tampering with evidence. It's a deportation case. One of ours." I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't feel something, but because everything I felt was buried under a stillness I'd spent years mastering. "You don't have to come," he added, "but I thought you should know." I booked the flight that night. No press, no announcement, no staff. San Antonio hadn't changed much, but I had. The courtroom was sterile and beige with overhead lights that hummed too loudly. I slipped in just before the hearing began, dressed in grey slacks and a black turtleneck. No security detail, no name tag. I took the last seat in the back row. Madeline sat at the defence table. Her hair was pulled back tight, her blazer crisp. Her eyes scanned the room like she was already building a narrative. She didn't see me. Not yet. The prosecutor laid out the case. A series of emails deleted just hours before court submission. A document was forged to remove a key witness. A whistleblower within the DA's office? The word tampering echoed more than once. Then the judge looked up, paused, tilted his head slightly, squinting toward the back. "Is that Governor Carter?" The room shifted, heads turned, murmurs flared and then died in unison. Madeline turned last, and when she saw me, her mouth parted just slightly. No sound, no words, just recognition, just memory weaponized by silence. My parents were there too. I hadn't noticed them until that moment. My mother in a beige shawl, clutching her purse like a shield. My father with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a split second, none of us moved. And then I blinked, sat straighter, crossed my legs. I didn't smile, I didn't flinch. I was not there to testify, not there to condemn, not even there to be acknowledged. I was there to exist, and in that room, my existence rewrote the air. Madeline looked away first. The trial proceeded. I stayed for the whole thing. Didn't speak, didn't move. I watched as the evidence was unspooled, as her defence cracked under pressure, as the truth came for her in the same sterile language she once used to erase mine. When the session ended, I stood and walked out before the judge adjourned. No one stopped me. Outside, the sun was sharp against the sidewalk. I walked past a cluster of cameras. They hadn't noticed me coming in. One caught me now. The lens turned. I kept walking. Somewhere behind me, a reporter said my name. I didn't turn around, because justice wasn't in that courtroom. It was in the silence I carried. The silence they once used against me, now mine to wield. Not as revenge, but as a declaration I never disappeared. I was just waiting to be undeniable. That night, I stayed in a quiet Airbnb a few blocks from the courthouse. The house was old Spanish, tile roof, iron gate sagging porch swing. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check the news. I sat by the window and watched dusk fold itself over the streets I used to walk as a girl. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Not for me. But it didn't need to be. I remembered Madeline teaching me how to braid my hair in that same soft San Antonio light. I remembered how she used to tuck her letters under my pillow, and how I used to believe every word of them, and I remembered the silence that came after. When family stops saying your name, it doesn't disappear. It just waits, coiled, dormant, ready to be spoken again if only to be reclaimed. I poured a glass of water. No toast, no speech, just the echo of a trial I didn't attend to win. The next morning before my flight, I visited the neighbourhood bakery where Carla once gave me soup in exchange for dishes. She wasn't there anymore, but a younger woman was. She handed me a pastry. On the house, she said. Why, I asked. She smiled. Because my mother said you once stopped someone from signing a paper they didn't understand. I took it, nodded, and stepped back into the sunlight. The weight of silence is real, but so is the way it teaches you to walk without asking for permission. That day in court wasn't revenge. It wasn't redemption. It was just a woman who once had her voice stripped away, sitting still enough to remind the room I am still here. It was just a woman who once had her voice stripped away, sitting still enough to remind the room I am still here. The media didn't take long to catch up. An old scar was ripped open within 48 hours of my quiet exit from the San Antonio courthouse. The clip, the one that had shattered me all those years ago, resurfaced, repackaged, reanalyzed. News anchors used terms like recontextualized and cultural conversation. But it was still the same grainy violation, now pixelated into a new brand of spectacle. Morning shows debated my resilience. Podcasts speculated on my true motives. And then he appeared. My ex. The boy who had filmed me without my consent. He sat under studio lights, feigning remorse, dressed in the kind of sweater PR teams pick when they want monsters to look relatable. I never meant to hurt her, he said, hands clasped like a penitent priest. We were young. She was complicated. Complicated. A word men use where they want to make a woman's pain sound like poetry instead of what it is evidence. My staff asked if I wanted to respond, write a statement, give a televised interview, reclaim the narrative. I told them no. I told them, let them look. My communications director blinked. Governor, the clip is trending. He's getting book offers. They're calling him a reformed advocate for consent. I looked at her, my voice was even. I survived being seen before. I can survive it again. Because I knew something they didn't. The worst thing that ever happened to me had already happened. And I was still here. What could a spotlight do to someone who'd learned to walk in darkness? The hardest part wasn't the attention, it was the cropping. Media outlets clipped old photographs, cutting me out of birthday scenes, family vacations, moments I once existed in. They juxtaposed my silence now with my absence. They're not realizing the irony. I was never invisible. I was erased. There's a difference. In a particularly viral piece, a panel of commentators discussed whether my emotional silence made me strategically admirable or psychologically cold. One said, she hasn't cried publicly, hasn't addressed the video. Is that strength or suppression? And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because for the first time their misunderstanding didn't hurt. Let them look, I thought again. Let them misread. Let them dissect. I didn't owe them softness. I didn't owe them anything. My silence wasn't a flaw. It was a boundary. A woman doesn't have to explain the wound just because you finally noticed the scar. One afternoon, I received a handwritten letter. No return address. Inside a copy of a high school photo, the one where I was cropped out in every publication. But here, the original. Intact. I was there, arms around Madeline, laughing. No edits, no red lines, just proof that I had always been the part of the frame. A post-it stuck to the back read, "They only crop what scares them." I didn't know who sent it. I didn't need to. That night, I placed the photo on my desk, not as nostalgia, but as reclamation. Every time someone asked for a quote, I declined. Every time a talk show offered a seat, I said no, because I had no desire to be a cautionary tale or a redemption arc. I was not a character in someone else's narrative. I was the author of my own silence. And if they wanted to look, let them. But they'd find nothing new. Because the most radical thing I could do, the most powerful stance I could take, was to live without offering them a spectacle, to exist without apology. And so I did, in policy rooms, in quiet strategy sessions, in the unphotographed hours between legislation and lived life. I wore no mic, offered no confessions. My face stayed out of the frame. And yet somehow my presence only grew, because sometimes the most unforgettable image is the one they tried hardest to erase and failed. The invitation came on a heavy cardstock, ivory white with gold embossed edges. Formal, tasteless, like it had been ordered in bulk for politicians, not daughters. Dinner at Hart Residence? This Sunday. 6 p.m. No signature, no warmth. Just 4 words typed neatly beneath, "We hope you'll come." For 15 years, they hadn't asked for my presence. Now, a dinner invite arrives like an official summons. I stared at it unmoved. I let it sit on my desk for 2 days under a copy of a housing bill I was revising, like it was the junk mail of grief. I arrived on time. Not out of respect, but strategy. Late would look bitter. Early desperate. On time meant I wasn't here for emotion, I was here to observe. The Hart house looked almost identical. Manicured shrubs, the white paint flaking, just slightly at the columns. But the camera above the door was new. I wondered if they installed it to watch the street, or to watch each other. The door opened before I knocked. My father stood there wearing a sweater I hadn't seen since childhood. "Eve," he said, like he was practicing it out loud for the first time. "It's good to see you," I offered a polite nod. Not a smile, not warmth. We were past performance. Or so I thought. Inside the house smelled like rosemary and varnish. Dinner was already plated, set for 4. The table was different too. Longer, wider. At its centre sat a brand new leather chair, darker than the others, elegant, sharp. It hadn't been there when I was growing up. That chair was for me. I knew it instinctively. The invitation wasn't a gesture of love. It was an offering of optics, a staged reunion for a family that had once thrown me to the wind. Madeline sat already perfectly postured, sipping from a crystal glass like she was prepping for a debate. My mother fussed with silverware even though nothing was out of place. I took my seat. The chair cradled me like it had waited, and maybe in some way it had. Dinner began with surface civility. My father asked about housing reform. Madeline praised a recent op-ed I hadn't written. My mother passed the roast with trembling hands. No one asked about Santa Fe, about where I slept when they changed the locks, about the girl who once stood on that porch, humiliated and unclaimed. Silence did the heavy lifting. Then came the pivot. Madeline reached across the table and touched my mother's wrist, a subtle cue. My mother put down her fork, took my hand gently. Her voice softened like she was auditioning for grace. "There's something we'd like to ask," she said, almost whispering. "It's nothing official, just a few words." With the prosecutor, a suggestion. You wouldn't have to intervene, just guide the conversation. Her fingers tightened. "We know you still have access." And there it was. Not an apology, not a confession, a transaction. The warmth in her tone wasn't maternal, it was tactical. This dinner wasn't about reconnecting, it was about negotiation. Madeline's case still under review. The evidence is mounting. And I am finally useful again. I looked down at the plate in front of me. The roast was perfectly cooked. The mashed potatoes were sculpted like clouds. This was the most effort they'd ever made for a meal I was meant to eat. But the food didn't matter. The gesture didn't matter. Only ask. I placed my fork down, wiped my mouth slowly, then turned to my mother. If I weren't governor, I said calmly, would I still be your blood? The room froze. No one answered, not immediately. My father reached for his glass. Madeline shifted in her seat. My mother blinked like she hadn't heard me, but she had. We all had. It wasn't a question. It was a mirror. A reflection they couldn't look away from. I stood. Thank you for dinner, I said. My voice didn't waver. But I have a policy against being used by the same people who erased me. I walked toward the door. No one stopped me. I didn't slam it, didn't raise my voice. But as I left, I looked at that leather chair one last time. Polished. Powerful. A monument to their revisionist memory. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't mine. That night, I returned to my hotel. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I simply took the invitation from my coat pocket, tore it slowly, piece by piece, and flushed each shred down the toilet. The water swirled, carrying it away, like history rewriting itself in reverse. When it was gone, I felt weightless. I poured myself a glass of wine. No toast, no closure, just breathe. And when I sat down at my own desk in a room no one decorated for me, in a life I built brick by silent brick, I realized something: power doesn't come from who invites you back. It comes from knowing you never needed the seat they offered. A week later, the call came. It wasn't urgent in tone, but something beneath the silence of Raphael's voice told me it mattered. Your mother's in the hospital, he said. Heart failure. They're stabilizing her, but... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I didn't ask who called him. I didn't ask why it was him and not my sister, not my father. I just listened. Then I booked a red-eye to San Antonio, packed nothing but a navy coat and the smallest sketchbook I owned. Hospitals are built to withstand grief. Every tile, every beep, every folded blanket feels like it's been designed to cushion impact. But nothing can soften the sight of a mother pale under fluorescent light. Tubes were threaded into her arms. Machines doing the work her heart no longer could. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if the years had taken bites out of her, and this moment was what remained. She was asleep when I arrived, or unconscious. I didn't ask, I didn't approach the bed. Instead, I pulled something from my coat pocket, a small canvas, wrapped in brown paper, and placed it gently on the side table. I unwrapped it slowly. It was a painting. Mine. One I had made months earlier, but never shown to anyone. It depicted a single figure standing in the middle of a desert. Their form was small, almost swallowed by the vastness. But what lingered was their shadow, long dark stretching behind them like a second self. Not sinister, just undeniable. The title painted faintly at the bottom was Witness. That was what I had come to be. Not a daughter, not a saviour. A witness. I didn't speak, didn't cry. I just stood there looking at the woman who had watched me be erased and said nothing. The woman whose silence once felt like betrayal, but now, through the lens of age and distance, felt like fear. She stirred once. Her eyes opened slightly, then closed again. I don't know if she saw me. I don't know if it mattered. What I do know is that I no longer need answers. I no longer carried questions like weapons. I had come not for closure, but for release. Not to receive love, but to stop holding the absence of it like a wound. I remembered her in fragments, her hands making soup, her rosary beads clicking late at night, the soft hum she'd sing when she thought no one was listening. I remembered the good, not because I wanted to forgive, but because I finally understood that memory itself isn't an oath. It's a mirror. And some mirrors are kind, even when the reflection isn't. Outside her room, Madeline was waiting. Her face looked tired in a way makeup couldn't mask. We locked eyes. For once, neither of us reached for language. We just nodded, two women too old for reconciliation, but perhaps young enough still for recognition. I walked past her, down the hall, out of the building, into the cold night that didn't bite as hard as I expected. That evening, I returned not to a hotel, but to the neighbourhood I once walked as a child. I passed the old library, now closed, the elementary school, still bearing a mural of smiling hands. Every corner hummed with ghosts, but none of them hurt anymore. They just lingered. I stopped outside our old church. The lights were on, but no one was inside. Through the glass doors, I saw the empty pew where my mother used to sit. I didn't go in, just stood there, the hum of the city muffled by stained glass. Later that night, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window in a rental I'd booked under another name. I pulled out a sketch pad and added something new to witness a sun, faint, almost hidden behind the figure. But there, present, real. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, only that it was no longer just a shadow stretching into emptiness. Now there was light, and light meant possibility. Forgiveness, I realised, doesn't always arrive wrapped in absolution. Sometimes it's quiet, shapeless, a shift in breath, a decision to stop expecting a different past. I hadn't come for a final moment. I hadn't come to be seen. I had come to honour what I survived by standing near what once made survival feel impossible. And in that, I wasn't Evelyn anymore. I wasn't Eve the governor. I was simply someone who came not to be invited back, but to say in her own way, I am here, still, without permission, without apology. The painting stayed in the hospital. I didn't leave a note, didn't sign it, but I knew she'd know it was from me. And maybe in that knowing she'd understand something. Not that I forgave her, but I no longer needed to. Because sometimes the act of showing up not for someone but for the truth of who you've become is the only kind of closure that matters. Because sometimes the act of showing up not for someone but for the truth of who you've become is the only kind of closure that matters. A month later, I stood before the grand chamber of state legislators, the vaulted ceiling echoing with silent anticipation. Behind me, aides whispered last-minute briefings. In front, uniform, rows of chairs, every seat filled with people whose decisions could change lives. I wore no sentimental token, just a tailored navy suit and a small cream-coloured folder containing the Justice Witness Protection Act. I took a steady breath. On that folder was typed only the title. Inside, carefully drafted language designed to protect public servants from threats, coercion, or manipulation, especially when those pressures stem from personal or familial relationships. No name, no anecdote, only principles, clauses, boundary tests, reporting mechanisms, and safe harbour provisions. It was dry on its face, radical beneath. I looked at the legislators, the doubters, the allies, the ones who used power like a weapon, and I spoke affirmatively. Integrity doesn't depend on the absence of temptation. It depends on the presence of protection. I did not mention Madeleine, our father, or the locked door. I simply talked about duty, public, personal, political, and how too often families become pipelines of influence with no accountability. One senator, longtime ally, leaned forward. Is this bill personal? Her tone was thinly veiled curiosity. I said, every bill is personal. That's what makes it public. I didn't sink into confession. I met her gaze and held the shape of truth. Afterwards, in the hallway, the press swarmed. They asked about family ties, about motive. I answered, the family that used to turn against me still holds more power than I do, but the law transcends personality. They wrote their headlines. I embraced my silence as conviction. Days later, committee votes began. I watched from my office gallery a university-style auditorium overlooking proceedings. Staffers passed me water. I stared at the bill's title emblazoned on every screen. Each clause, past reporting protections, mental health support, whistleblower confidentiality, and palletized safety nets. Step by step, we built walls around those meant to be served by power, not controlled by it. The final vote, 52-50 in favour. Enough for passage. Enough to survive the governor's desk as I was governor. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I returned to the quiet of my study. The folder was gone. In its place, a printed and signed certificate. I placed it on my desk next to a candle. I lit it not to celebrate, but to watch light hold its shape against darkness. That evening, I penned a private note beneath the framed certificate. They don't need to know why you wrote it, only why you stood behind it. I didn't publish it. I didn't tweet it. I didn't need to. The next morning, local headlines focused on the bill's impact. Governor protects integrity of government public trust gets fortified. I allowed them their angle, because justice isn't ornamental, it's structural. It doesn't belong in speeches or plaques. It lives in protections that keep human frailty from becoming official wrongdoing. In the days that followed, I received messages from public servants, a city inspector whose family had pressured him to bend a regulation, a judge whose sibling threatened to blackmail her with personal recordings, a deputy who'd been silenced into compliance. They thanked me quietly by phone or message. None asked to meet or describe their pain. The silence between us was recognition enough. None of them was Madeleine. But maybe one day they would be helped before their family binds them. Maybe this bill would be the line someone chose not to cross because I drew it first. That afternoon, I returned to the canvas witness and added subtle revisions, a glimmer on the horizon, a ripple at the figure's feet. Not dramatic changes. Enough to show movement. Enough to show that what is watched and stands witness can still shift the ground beneath it. Because justice isn't about aesthetics, it isn't about optics, it's about boundaries drawn, maintained, enforced. It's the message sent in the silence of refusal, the echo of a moment when someone looked at their own reflection and decided the world needed proof that hurt didn't have to be generational. The Justice Witness Protection Act stands now in law as testament power can heal or hurt, but it must never weaponize what once hurt. But it must never weaponize what once hurt. A month later, I stepped into the cavernous main hall of the Family and Justice Reform Summit, an event I had helped convene but dreaded attending. Rows of seats stretched toward the stage like audience-ready verdicts. Policymakers in crisp suits buzzed about implementation. Survivors in plain dress waited for stories that meant something more than slogans. I paused just inside the entrance and felt the hum of anticipation like an electric current in the air when something important is about to shift. I carried nothing but a small envelope in my pocket. No folders, no prepared remarks, no ceremonial token. Before finding my seat, I walked down the centre aisle to the front row and sat the envelope on an empty leather chair identical to the one that had once been thrust upon me at that Hart family dinner, polished, imposing, transactional. I unfolded the seal back on the envelope and laid inside a snap, a small metal bracket meant for an award unused, unsent, invisible evidence of the honours and narratives I'd been offered then and rejected now. The chair remained bare. When I reached the podium, a hush fell. I paused above the empty seat, took a measured breath, then said, I reserved this seat tonight for someone who no longer sits beside me, my sister. Not out of invitation, but remembrance. I saw heads tilt, some registers of curiosity and others surprise. 15 years ago, I continued a family erased me with the smooth efficiency of turning a key. I didn't object. I walked away, rebuilt my life-built policy. I let the room absorb it. That empty chair represents what was lost and the fact that loss is not betrayal. It doesn't need an apology. Sometimes, the hardest truth is recognizing that not everyone journeys to the end with us. I looked into the audience, letting the lack of filler linger. Silence should not be the price of belonging. A single sentence, but weighty. I explained that every time public servants sense the price of their voice, is their family ties we need legal tangibility like the Witness Protection Act for those screened pressures. I referred to the lives that had quietly shifted because of the legislation, the city clerk who got a night guard after refusing a permit bribe from a relative, the prosecutor who filed charges against a former friend thanks to safe harbour protections, the social worker who reported elder abuse twice when she might once have hesitated. I wove policy and personal into a single thread. If I left this seat empty merely for ritual, that would be vanity. I left it to remind us all some chairs are empty so others can sit without fear. I didn't mention names, not Madeline, not our father, but there was recognition in the room. After I spoke, I stepped down. Approaching the chair, I straightened an edge of the envelope and a slight gesture took a ribbon from it and draped it over the chair's armrest. It was subtle but symbolic, the ribbon neither gift nor demand, but a quiet acknowledgement that some ties, even when not embraced, still shape you. The hush shifted into ripples. At the reception afterward, I hovered with soft conversations around me. Someone asked why an empty chair. I replied, because absence doesn't erase memory, and memory isn't a liability. It's the soil where truth grows. Later, a reporter approached with a phone. Will it become a signature moment, your signature image? I answered. No. But if it sparks broader conversations about family pressure in public service, then yes. I walked away, leaving them with that thought. That night, I returned to my study, closed the curtains against city lights, and sketched a second silhouette on the envelope, just a stroke representing two figures separated by distance, but tethered at the base. Not reconciliation, nor farewell, not erasure, just acknowledgement. Days later, images of the stage circulated online, me behind the podium, the empty chair to one side, a stark, silent icon. Comments ranged. Powerful symbolism. Omitting an apology is still cold, brings truth in absence. Politicians always do something for optics. I stayed silent again. I let interpretation live outside my story, because this chair and its emptiness wasn't curated for optics. It was carved from my truth, not for their approval, but for my integrity. In the weeks after the summit, the image of the chair became shorthand in activist circles for boundary leadership. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition of what was lost. It prompted other public figures, judges, educators, even religious leaders to ask their platforms whether they, too, should name absences in their own stories. Some displayed empty chairs at events. Others unveiled plaques citing people who had shaped them but were not present, but never again were those chairs meant to suggest absolution. And at home, I took the endorsed certificate from Part 9, the signed Justice Witness Protection Act, and placed it beside that envelope in my study. The certificate represented law. The envelope represented a story. Together, they formed a new kind of memoir, not one of silence or absence, but one of structural integrity grafted onto personal resilience. I still refuse to allow the empty chair to become a pedestal of pity. It's not about the wound, it's about how we choose to honour it, without letting it define us. Not a badge of honour, but a bookmark for the next chapter. And I walked forward, leaning into policy rooms and quiet meetings, carrying that silent witness with me, knowing that integrity is not celebratory. It's steadfast. The next morning I returned to the Capitol. My heels echoed along the marble floor of the West Wing, each step a quiet refusal to shrink. Reporters waited near the elevator bank, their badges tilted forward like microphones. Governor Carter, one of them, called out, stepping beside me with careful energy. We were hoping for a quick comment. I nodded politely. No escape in avoidance, only in control. On the summit, I asked, pretending not to know what he truly wanted. No, he said. About your family, about Madeline. He hesitated, voice softer. About the chair. The question hung like humidity, too warm, too invasive. I glanced at the recorder in his hand, the red dot blinking like a question mark. I've already told my story, I said. I'm not rewriting it. His eyebrows raised slightly like that answer had cost me something. But it hadn't. Because silence, I had learned, wasn't erasure. It was protection. Not just of myself, but of what I had already built with my words. And I wasn't going to let anyone hollow those words out for the sake of spectacle. He pushed a little more. Don't you think voters deserve context? I stopped walking, turned to him fully. They have it, I said evenly. In the policies I write, in the votes I take. My record is my context. But the public, he began. I cut in, not sharp, just steady. The public doesn't need another trauma retold. They need housing, protection, dignity. A pause. Let's not confuse curiosity with necessity. He nodded, scribbled something, and stepped back. As I turned away, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Across the rotunda, partially obscured by a wooden renovation barrier, someone stood still. My father, Gregory Hart, leaning silent hands in pockets like he was just another bureaucrat on break. But he wasn't. He was watching, not as a councilman, not as a father seeking forgiveness, but as someone finally out of roles to perform. I didn't walk to him. He didn't call to me. But in the space between us, something unspoken passed. Not reconciliation, not peace, but pause. A moment of not hurting. Sometimes that's enough. The wooden wall he leaned on, unassuming plain, felt symbolic. Not a door, not a bridge, just a clean, quiet boundary. Something neither of us needed to cross anymore. I walked on. That afternoon, my chief of staff entered my office, holding a list of potential interviews. They keep asking about the chair, she said. Do you want to shape the narrative? I looked at her kindly. No, I said. Let them shape whatever story they want. I've already written mine. She smiled, relieved, maybe, or inspired, then left me alone. I sat at my desk and opened my sketchbook, flipped to a new page, drew a simple image, a chair in the centre of a room, a shadow stretching beneath it, not dramatic, not haunting, just present. I labelled it Presence Without Permission, because I hadn't been invited into my family's story. I had claimed my own. That weekend, an article went viral, a think piece dissecting Governor Carter's strategic use of emotional opacity. It quoted experts on performative stoicism and survivor branding. It included childhood photos, some grainy, others cruelly cropped. In one image, I stood at the edge of a school stage, cut nearly in half by a microphone stand. Her literal marginalization, the caption read. I closed the tab, laughed softly. Not out of amusement, but because they still didn't get it. I wasn't on the margins. I had just stopped auditioning. Days later, I received a letter. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago, the story of my father's retirement from the police force. The ink had yellowed the page soft at the edges. A post-it was stuck to the corner. On it, 4 words he never knew how. No signature, no explanation. But I understood. My father had never known how to love without command, to father without condition. And maybe he still didn't. But at least now he stood still instead of standing in the way. And maybe that was its own kind of growth. I placed the clipping in the back of my sketchbook, not as proof, but as perspective. My story didn't need new antagonists or redemptions, just a room. And silence was the room I chose. The next month, I gave a keynote speech at a private education fund summit. I talked about policy, about safety nets, about systems built not to rescue but to empower. I didn't mention family, or Madeleine, or trauma. But afterward, a high school teacher approached me. She was crying quietly. "I teach girls like you," she said. "They're invisible until they break. Then everyone wants their pieces." I reached for her hand, held it. "Then teach them to stay whole," I said, "even if no one looks." That evening, I sat in my study alone with the low hum of a city I once feared would consume me. I lit a candle, not for drama, not for pain, but for light, and I wrote one last sentence at the bottom of my newest painting. "Not your spotlight, not your story, still mine." The next morning, I stepped outside my apartment, laced up my old leather shoes, the ones scuffed from years of commuting, of walking between coffee shops and courtrooms, and headed into the city. No motorcade, no security detail, just me, the concrete, and the faint hum of morning traffic. As I walked, I felt a curious liberation, each step unaccompanied, each footfall, a quiet statement that I was no longer fleeing. I was present. I moved through familiar streets, the bakery where Carla once gave me soup, the clinic hallway where I intervened, the Capitol steps where I'd sworn an oath all without notice, as though I belonged entirely to my own path. I passed a small park bench and paused, watching a group of children play chase among the trees. Their laughter threaded through the city's rhythm like an overlooked melody. I realised I carried more than political victories now. I carried a history woven into the very streets beneath my feet. Then it happened. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 with a backpack too large for her frame, skipped ahead and then turned back, gaze fixed on me as I approached. "Excuse me," she said, voice skipping like a pebble over water. "Are you that lady from the video?" I stopped heart steady and looked at her. No reporters, no flashing cameras, just a child searching for a story behind the stranger. I knelt to meet her at eye level. "Which video?" I asked softly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. She tilted her head. "The one, you know," she swallowed. "The one about the lady who got hurt but then became strong." Her words tumbled out tentative but earnest. I smiled, genuine warm. "That would be a lot of different people," I said, reaching into my pocket and giving her a gentle nod. "But I'm just someone who didn't stop." Her face brightened as though she recognised a simple honesty she'd been looking for. She smiled back, shy and triumphant. "Thank you," she said, then scurried off toward her family. I watched her go, chest like the city noise settling into the background. In that moment, I understood identity isn't built in headlines or names. It's the quiet recognition in someone else's eyes, the idea that action, not identity, shapes legacy. And that was the truth. All these years, I wasn't trying to return to who I was. I was learning how to stay with who I am. Not the erased daughter, not the polished governor, just Eve, present, whole. I no longer carry the ache for an apology. I carry discernment. I don't wait for reconciliation. I offer presence. Healing didn't arrive in one grand moment. It came in fragments. A policy passed. A silence held a boundary respected. I am not spotless, but I am no longer unseen. What I've learned is this: we don't have to rewrite the past to write ourselves forward. We don't need every chair at the table filled. Sometimes all it takes is knowing that what you've built in the quiet can outlast the noise. So if you're listening, if any part of this story is yours too, I hope you'll share it. Drop a thought below. And if you're still becoming still walking, I hope you'll stay with us. Subscribe if you'd like, but more importantly, keep going. Thank you for being here. Truly,